History often paints a picture of progress, of communities coming together, and of nations moving forward. But sometimes, beneath the surface of what we think we know, there are stories so dark, so painful, that they have been deliberately buried for decades. Today, we uncover one of those stories, a chapter of American history that remains largely unknown to most: the Slocum Massacre of 1910. Imagine a small, quiet town in East Texas, where the summer sun beats down on farmland and the air carries the sounds of daily life. Black families in Slocum were working hard, tending to their land, running small businesses, raising their children, and building lives filled with hope and determination. Their successes were a testament to resilience in a society that often sought to keep them down, a quiet assertion that they too deserved dignity, opportunity, and security. But in July 1910, that peaceful life was shattered. A white, fueled by fear, jealousy, and deeply ingrained racial prejudices, descended upon the community, armed with rifles, pistols, and shotguns. They did not ask questions. They did not issue warnings. They attacked with deadly intent. Women and children were killed. Homes were set ablaze. Families were torn apart. Survivors had no choice but to flee into the surrounding woods, leaving behind everything they had worked so hard to build. This was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. It was a calculated act born from systemic racism and economic envy, a tragic reflection of the climate of fear and oppression that Black Americans faced in the early 20th century. The Slocum Massacre exemplifies how communities that dared to prosper could become targets of unimaginable violence simply for seeking a life of stability and success. Today, most history books barely mention what happened in Slocum. The massacre was largely erased from public memory, leaving families to grieve in silence and survivors to carry trauma for the rest of their lives. But these stories deserve to be told. They are reminders of the resilience of those who endured, the injustice they faced, and the urgent need to confront and remember our history honestly. In this video, we will take you step by step through the events leading up to the massacre, the terrifying day itself, and the long-lasting impact on the survivors and their descendants. We will also explore the broader social and historical context, shedding light on the systemic forces that made such tragedies possible. By telling these stories, we honor the lives that were lost and ensure that this dark chapter is never forgotten. If you are ready to uncover the truth, to hear voices that history tried to silence, and to understand the lasting legacy of Slocum, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss any of our deep dives into forgotten histories. Together, we can shine a light on stories that have long been hidden and ensure that the lessons of the past guide a more just future. The summer of 1910 in Slocum, Texas, was not just hot in temperature, but heavy with tension, a tension that had been simmering for decades. To understand why such a horrific event could unfold in what seemed to be an ordinary rural town, we must first step back and look at the world that Black families in Slocum were navigating, a world shaped by laws, customs, and social norms designed to deny them dignity, security, and opportunity. The massacre did not happen in isolation. It was the culmination of systemic forces that had been building since the end of the Civil War, forces that intertwined fear, prejudice, and economic control in ways that left entire communities exposed to violence. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, the promises of equality and federal protection that had briefly illuminated a path forward for Black Americans were systematically dismantled, leaving Black communities across the South to fend for themselves under a rising tide of white supremacy. In Texas, as in many other Southern states, the legal and social frameworks of the Jim Crow era entrenched segregation and reinforced the idea that Black people were second-class citizens. effectively barring them from fully participating in civic life. Education and economic growth. Schools were separate and unequal. Public spaces were divided by arbitrary lines of color, and opportunities for political engagement were deliberately obstructed through literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation, creating a climate in which black communities were vulnerable not only to daily indignities but also to organized acts of violence. Within this framework, any success, whether the ownership of land, the running of a profitable business, or the ability to send children to school, was viewed not as a natural aspiration but as a provocation, a challenge to a social order that sought to keep black Americans powerless and subordinate. Slocum was a small, tight-knit community where families had worked tirelessly to establish a foothold, and their quiet progress, instead of being celebrated, stirred envy and resentment among their white neighbors, resentment that was often amplified by rumors, misinformation, and a deeply ingrained fear of losing control. It was in this context that whispers of a potential black uprising began to circulate, unsubstantiated yet potent, feeding into the anxieties of local white residents and creating an atmosphere in which paranoia could quickly transform into deadly action. The legal and civic structures that might have provided protection were either complicit or impotent, failing to intervene, failing to investigate, and in some cases lending credibility to the false claims that justified the mob's intentions. Law enforcement officers, local officials, and even newspapers participated in a social narrative that dehumanized black residents and framed them as threats, reinforcing a collective mindset that made violence seem not only acceptable but necessary to preserve the social hierarchy. Against this backdrop, the lives of black families in Slocum were marked by a constant, underlying anxiety, a fear that the progress they had achieved, the land they had cultivated, and the homes they had built could all be wiped away in an instant. This fear was not imagined. It was grounded in the reality of thousands of documented lynchings, racially motivated attacks, and organized massacres that had taken place across the South. Every day, the people of Slocum navigated a delicate balance between striving for normalcy, working the land, raising children, running businesses, and surviving in a world where their mere presence could be construed as a threat. The tension reached its peak not because of any immediate conflict, but because systemic racism had created an environment in which success was criminalized, ambition was feared, and survival was contingent on the mercy of a society determined to maintain a racial hierarchy at all costs. Within this environment, the massacre became tragically predictable. The underlying social, legal, and economic conditions had already set the stage for disaster. On the morning of the attack, as families went about their routines, they were living within a powder keg of fear and resentment, and the slightest spark, whether a rumor, a minor dispute, or a perceived slight, was enough to ignite the devastating eruption that would follow. The forces that shaped the Jim Crow South were not abstract. They were tangible, affecting every aspect of daily life, from the schools children attended to the doors they could open, to the streets they could walk safely. They dictated that black residents of Slocum could aspire, but only within tightly constrained limits, and that any deviation, any measure of independence, could be interpreted as rebellion. The massacre, therefore, was not merely a spontaneous outburst of hatred. It was the manifestation of a society in which systemic racism had been institutionalized to such a degree that extreme violence became an instrument to enforce compliance and suppress black progress. The stories of the victims and survivors illustrate the human dimension of these forces. Families uprooted, homes destroyed, lives ended, and a community's future stripped away in a single day. Yet within these narratives, one can also see the resilience and determination of those who lived through it, who preserved oral histories, carried forward traditions, and maintained the memory of what had happened despite the concerted efforts to erase their existence from public records. By connecting the events of Slocum to the broader context of the Jim Crow era, we gain a deeper understanding of how laws, social norms, economic pressures, and collective fear combined to create a perfect storm of oppression and violence, demonstrating that tragedies like Slocum were not anomalies but predictable outcomes of a system designed to control, marginalize, and terrorize. This perspective not only honors the memory of those who suffered but also challenges us to confront the ways in which systemic inequality can persist when left unaddressed, reminding us that the lessons of history are essential guides for building a more just and equitable society today. By the summer of 1910, Slocum, Texas, had become a town simmering with unspoken tensions. A place where the quiet ambitions of black families intersected with the simmering anxieties of their white neighbors, creating an atmosphere ripe for disaster. For years, the black residents of Slocum had worked tirelessly to carve out a life of dignity, tending their farms, managing small businesses, and raising children with the hope that their efforts would provide stability and opportunity for future generations. Yet in a society still dominated by the oppressive structures of Jim Crow, their achievements were not met with admiration or acceptance but with suspicion, envy, and fear. Even minor successes, a newly acquired plot of land, a prosperous harvest, or a thriving store could be twisted in the minds of others into signs of defiance, evidence that the social order was being challenged. Into this charged environment, whispers began to spread, rumors that were entirely unfounded yet devastating in their impact, claiming that the black residents of Slocum were organizing an uprising, stockpiling weapons, or planning acts of retaliation against white neighbors. These stories were not grounded in fact. They were fueled by fear, misunderstanding, and the prejudices ingrained in a community that had been conditioned to see black independence as a threat. The rumors moved swiftly, traveling from house to house, from one farm to the next, gaining weight with each retelling, until a sense of imminent danger pervaded the town. At the same time, economic jealousy amplified the impact of these rumors, as some white residents viewed the modest prosperity of black families as a direct challenge to their own social and financial standing. What might have been minor disputes or routine interactions were interpreted through the lens of suspicion and animosity. Even an everyday disagreement involving a single black resident, in this case a man named Abe Wilson, became magnified, twisted, and circulated as evidence of a larger, imagined conspiracy. In a town already on edge, these factors combined to create a volatile situation in which fear and paranoia could easily override reason. The black residents of Slocum, aware of the underlying tensions yet going about their lives as best they could, lived in a constant state of unease, recognizing that any misstep, real or imagined, might have grave consequences. Conversations in homes and churches were punctuated by nervous speculation, and community leaders urged caution, prayer, and vigilance. Yet even these measures could do little to stem the growing wave of hysteria. Meanwhile, the broader social environment ensured that there was little recourse for the threatened families. Law enforcement and local officials, influenced by the same prejudices and fears, either ignored early warning signs or lent tacit support to the dominant narrative, validating the false claims and emboldening those who believed that action was necessary to preserve control. The stage was thus set for catastrophe, and the tension in Slocum reached a breaking point when rumors, jealousy, and an unresolved dispute converged on a single day. The mere sight of a black man traveling along a rural road or tending to his land could be enough to spark confrontation. with imagined threats magnified by the collective anxiety that had been cultivated over months and years. In this environment, ordinary people became participants in extraordinary violence, swept along by a shared sense of urgency and righteousness that left no room for questioning or empathy. The massacre that followed was not a spontaneous outbreak of chaos. It was the predictable eruption of a community whose social, economic, and psychological pressures had been carefully constructed over time. Families who had lived peacefully, working to build a secure and prosperous life, suddenly found themselves targeted not because of anything they had done, but because of what they represented: ambition, independence, and the possibility of a future that defied the oppressive social order. As the white mob descended upon Slocum, armed and resolute, the rumors and grievances that had been circulating for weeks coalesced into violent action. The terror was immediate and indiscriminate, striking men, women, and children alike, destroying homes and livelihoods in a matter of hours. Survivors fled into the surrounding woods, carrying with them only what they could grasp, while the imagined threat that had been used to justify the attack lay shattered, a grim reminder of how fear and prejudice can manufacture its own reality with deadly consequences. The events in Slocum reveal not only the destructive power of baseless rumors and economic envy, but also the fragility of communities living under systemic oppression. The massacre was a tragic illustration of how misinformation, amplified by fear and social tension, can escalate into acts of violence that leave deep and lasting scars on entire generations. It underscores the importance of understanding the ways in which societies can be manipulated by perception, prejudice, and the selective interpretation of events, and it serves as a solemn reminder that vigilance, empathy, and truth are vital tools in preventing history from repeating itself. The stories of survivors and their descendants, preserved through oral histories and personal testimony, offer a window into the human cost of rumor-driven hysteria, economic resentment, and the relentless pressures of an unequal social order, ensuring that the lessons of Slocum endure long after the events themselves, challenging us to confront fear with understanding, and to recognize the profound consequences of allowing suspicion and jealousy to dictate the actions of a community. The day the Slocum massacre erupted, the quiet rhythms of life in the small East Texas town were violently shattered by a force that had been silently gathering in the shadows. Fueled by fear, envy, and deeply entrenched prejudice, hundreds of white men, armed with rifles, shotguns, and pistols, descended upon the black community. Their numbers overwhelming, their intentions unmistakably deadly, and their actions methodically coordinated. This was not an unplanned outburst of anger, nor was it a chaotic scramble of unconnected individuals. It was a calculated, deliberate effort to terrorize and annihilate a community that had dared to exist and prosper beyond the limitations imposed by a society steeped in racial oppression. The men moved with frightening precision, spreading through the town in waves, targeting homes, families, and anyone who sought to resist or hide from the inevitable. The black residents, who had spent their lives cultivating land, raising children, and building businesses, suddenly found themselves in a nightmare they could never have imagined. A situation where the only choice was to run, hide, or face immediate death. The mob's brutality was indiscriminate. Fathers who had labored in the fields, mothers who had nurtured their families, and children who had innocently played in the sunlight were all equally vulnerable. No one was spared, and no act of mercy was extended. Houses that had taken years to build, filled with memories and hard-earned possessions, were set ablaze, their flames consuming not just material wealth, but the very sense of security and hope that had sustained the community for generations. As the mob advanced, the air was filled with the sounds of shattering wood, crackling fires, and the terrifying roar of gunfire. a cacophony that echoed the chaos and despair sweeping through Slocum. Families huddled together, clutching one another, praying that somehow they might survive. But the scale of the assault left little room for hope. In the forests surrounding the town, terrified residents crouched in silence, listening to the distant screams and the steady pounding of the mob as it moved with ruthless intent, knowing that any movement, any sound, could draw attention and end their lives. The coordinated nature of the attack revealed the depth of planning and the collective mindset that had brought it into being. This was not random violence but an orchestrated attempt to eradicate a community, to send a message that black success and independence would not be tolerated, and to instill terror that would linger for generations. In the midst of this horror, individual acts of courage and resilience emerged. Some families managed to escape into the woods, navigating unfamiliar terrain with only the guidance of one another's whispers and the faint light of the setting sun. Mothers and fathers risked their own safety to shield their children, leading them silently through dense underbrush and treacherous paths, determined to keep them alive despite the ever-present threat of discovery. One woman, known for her steadfast faith and knowledge of the land, carried her children and a cherished family Bible through the forests, her determination and presence of mind preserving not only their lives but a symbol of heritage and identity that would endure long after the flames had consumed their home. These acts of survival, though small against the overwhelming scale of violence, demonstrated the remarkable resilience and courage of those facing unimaginable circumstances, and they serve as a poignant counterpoint to the cruelty that sought to erase an entire community. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on those who witnessed the attack cannot be overstated. Children saw their parents struck down, families were torn apart before their eyes, and the very foundations of their existence, home, land, and community, were obliterated in a matter of hours. The horror was compounded by the realization that the legal and social systems that might have offered protection were either absent or actively complicit. The perpetrators faced no accountability, and the survivors were left to grapple with the trauma alone. The physical destruction of Slocum mirrored the devastation of its social fabric. Homes reduced to ashes, fields abandoned, and livelihoods destroyed symbolized not just the immediate loss but the long-term erasure of generational wealth, stability, and opportunity. The massacre was an instrument of control as much as an expression of hatred, reinforcing a social hierarchy that sought to suppress any challenge to white supremacy. Yet even amidst the devastation, the memory of the community's vibrancy, the industriousness of its residents, and the courage displayed in the face of terror endured. Oral histories and family accounts preserved the stories of those who survived, keeping alive the lessons and truths that official records sought to suppress or ignore. These narratives reveal not only the mechanics of the massacre, but also the resilience of the human spirit, the determination to remember and honor those lost, and the imperative to confront history honestly so that the consequences of prejudice and coordinated violence are never forgotten. The events of that day underscore a sobering reality, that collective action, when driven by fear, envy, and deeply ingrained prejudice, can manifest in extraordinary violence, devastating entire communities, and leaving scars that echo across generations. They also highlight the courage and resourcefulness of those who, despite facing overwhelming odds, chose survival and preservation over despair, carrying forward not only their own lives but the legacy of those who were silenced. The coordinated attack in Slocum thus stands as both a warning and a testament, a warning of what can occur when hatred and rumor combine unchecked, and a testament to the endurance of those who refuse to be erased, ensuring that the memory of a community and the lessons of its suffering persist through time, calling each generation to reflection, empathy, and action. In the aftermath of the Slocum massacre, silence descended over the town as heavily and oppressively as the smoke that had risen from burning homes. a silence that was cultivated and enforced by both social custom and institutional neglect, ensuring that the stories of suffering, courage, and survival remained largely hidden from public view for decades. No one among the hundreds of armed men who had carried out the attack was ever held accountable, not because their actions were excusable or beyond reproach, but because the very systems designed to uphold justice were complicit in maintaining the racial hierarchy that had precipitated the violence in the first place. Law enforcement, local officials, and courts entities that might have provided a path to restitution or acknowledgement either turned a blind eye or actively reinforced the narrative that the massacre had been justified, portraying it in newspapers as a reaction to imagined threats, while history books omitted it entirely, excising the lives and experiences of Slocum's black residents from the broader story of Texas and American history. For the survivors, the consequences of that day extended far beyond the immediate physical danger. They faced a landscape in which trauma was constant, security was non-existent, and displacement was an unavoidable reality. Families were forced to flee, leaving behind homes, land, businesses, and possessions that had taken years to accumulate. Possessions that might have provided economic stability and a foundation for generational wealth. The psychological burden of having witnessed, or narrowly escaped, such extreme violence was compounded by the ongoing knowledge that their community had been erased, that their neighbors who had perpetrated the attack would face no punishment, and that the broader society would act as though the atrocity had never occurred. Children who survived were robbed of their innocence, having seen the destruction of family, home, and community, and grew into adults carrying memories of terror, grief, and uncertainty, memories that often manifested in anxiety, mistrust, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Survivors faced the dual task of preserving what remained of their lives while navigating a world in which systemic racism continued to limit economic opportunities, education, and social mobility, leaving them not only grieving but struggling to rebuild. The material losses inflicted by the massacre: land seized or abandoned, homes destroyed, livelihoods interrupted, translate into generational economic setbacks. As families who might have passed on property and resources to their descendants were instead forced to start over, frequently in unfamiliar areas, often without any community support. Over time, these losses compounded, contributing to cycles of poverty and marginalization that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath, demonstrating that the consequences of such violence are not merely measured in lives lost, but in the long-term deprivation and structural inequalities it enforces. The suppression of the massacre in newspapers and public records further amplified this injustice, allowing the perpetrator's version of events to dominate and leaving survivors with few avenues to ensure that their truth was recognized or remembered. Oral histories and family recollections became essential lifelines, preserving the details of what had occurred and maintaining a record of resilience, courage, and mourning that official accounts refused to acknowledge. These narratives, passed down across generations, became a testament not only to the horrors endured but also to the human capacity to endure and resist erasure, serving as an enduring reminder of the importance of memory, accountability, and acknowledgement in the process of historical justice. The erasure of Slocum from history textbooks and mainstream discourse was not merely an act of omission. It was a continuation of the violence itself, a means of silencing voices and denying the significance of Black lives, illustrating the insidious ways in which systemic oppression can extend beyond immediate physical threats to affect collective memory, identity, and social consciousness. Yet even amidst this enforced silence, the persistence of survivors' stories, the careful preservation of family histories, and the community's ongoing efforts to reclaim their past have challenged this suppression. ensuring that the massacre is no longer invisible. By confronting both the brutality of the events and the institutional complicity that allowed them to go unpunished, we gain insight into the enduring effects of racial violence, the psychological and economic tolls borne by victims and their descendants, and the critical importance of remembrance and justice in healing collective wounds. The Slocum Massacre, while obscured for over a century, teaches us that the absence of accountability compounds suffering, and that acknowledging and preserving these histories is essential not only to honor those who endured unimaginable pain, but also to illuminate the mechanisms through which prejudice, fear, and indifference can devastate communities. It underscores that trauma, displacement, and economic loss are not merely consequences of a single violent event, but the echoes of systemic failures that ripple across generations, shaping opportunities, identities, and the very fabric of community life. By listening to survivors' accounts, studying the social and legal context that allowed such atrocities to occur, and confronting the deliberate attempts at historical erasure, we confront uncomfortable truths about the past while equipping ourselves to recognize, challenge, and prevent the conditions that permit similar injustices in the present. The story of Slocum is thus both a warning and a call to action. A warning that unchecked prejudice and institutional neglect can culminate in devastation, and a call to ensure that memory, truth, and accountability serve as the foundations upon which communities can heal, rebuild, and thrive, honoring the lives lost while preventing future generations from experiencing similar injustice. As we reflect on the Slocum Massacre of 1910, it becomes clear that this tragedy was far more than an isolated event. It was a manifestation of the systemic forces that shaped the lives of Black communities across the South during the Jim Crow era. Forces that combined racial animosity, economic envy, and social manipulation into a deadly formula of oppression. The massacre itself, carried out with chilling coordination by hundreds of armed men, illustrates the devastating consequences when fear, prejudice, and rumor are allowed to dictate action, when collective anxieties are weaponized to justify violence, and when entire communities are dehumanized for the perceived threat they pose simply by existing and striving for better lives. The residents of Slocum, who had labored for years to build homes, businesses, and families, were targeted not for any crime they had committed but for embodying ambition, independence, and hope, qualities that challenged the oppressive social order of the time. This pattern, tragically common in the South, demonstrates how racial violence was not merely a reaction to isolated incidents but a structural tool designed to enforce hierarchy, suppress economic advancement, and instill fear across Black populations, leaving legacies of trauma and inequality that would ripple through generations. The human cost of the massacre was immense. Women and children lost their lives, while survivors were forced to flee, abandoning homes, possessions, and the communities they had painstakingly built. The psychological impact endured, shaping lives with the weight of grief, fear, and trauma. Children who witnessed the violence grew up carrying the memory of their parents' suffering, while adults were confronted with the daunting task of rebuilding lives in the shadow of systemic neglect and social hostility. The economic consequences were equally severe. Wealth, property, and opportunity that could have been passed to future generations were destroyed, entrenching cycles of poverty and limiting upward mobility. The massacre serves as a stark illustration of how racial violence extended beyond immediate physical harm, reaching deep into the structural and social fabric of society, systematically undermining Black communities for decades. Moreover, the Slocum Massacre reveals the dangerous dynamics of mob mentality and social conformity under oppressive conditions. ordinary individuals, swept up in collective fear and prejudice, participated in acts of unimaginable brutality, illustrating how social pressures can override moral judgment and empathy. The rapid spread of baseless rumors, combined with economic resentment and long-standing racial hierarchies, created a climate in which violence was rationalized as self-defense or preservation of social order, highlighting the complex interplay of psychology, culture, and systemic oppression in fomenting mass violence. These lessons resonate even today, reminding us how misinformation, prejudice, and unchecked fear can escalate into acts that devastate entire communities if left unchallenged. Yet, even in the midst of horror and loss, the resilience of the survivors and their descendants stands as a testament to human courage and endurance. Through oral histories, family stories, and persistent efforts to reclaim the narrative, the memory of those who lived through the Slocum massacre has been preserved, ensuring that the lives erased from the map are not erased from history. Their stories remind us that acknowledging past injustices is essential, not only to honor those who suffered but also to confront the structural inequalities and prejudices that allowed such atrocities to occur. The process of remembrance becomes a tool for justice, healing, and education, enabling us to learn from history and apply those lessons to foster more equitable, compassionate societies. The Slocum massacre is more than a tale of past tragedy. It is a call to reflection and action. It challenges us to recognize the deep-seated patterns of racial violence, to confront the economic and social structures that perpetuate inequality, and to understand the long-term consequences of silenced communities and unaccountable acts. It encourages us to amplify the voices of those who were historically marginalized, to preserve their stories, and to ensure that such injustices are neither forgotten nor repeated. By learning from Slocum, we can better understand the intersections of systemic oppression, human behavior, and resilience, and apply that understanding to build communities where equity, respect, and justice are not ideals but lived realities. As we conclude this story, it is vital to remember that the massacre is not just a historical event, it is a lens through which we can examine the ongoing challenges faced by Black communities and the importance of collective responsibility in addressing inequality and preventing violence. Honoring the memory of Slocum is about more than remembering the past. It is about committing to a future where no community is terrorized for the pursuit of progress and where history is a guide for compassion, justice, and vigilance against prejudice. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this hidden chapter of history. If this story moved you or inspired reflection, please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it so that more people can learn and carry forward the lessons of Slocum. By engaging with these stories, we honor the lives affected and ensure that their memories continue to shape a more just and understanding world. Together, we can make sure that the echoes of Slocum are not forgotten, that awareness leads to empathy, and that history becomes a foundation for meaningful change.